This video is going to introduce you to F. Scott Fitzgerald and to the short story Babylon Revisited. I'm starting with his tombstone just because it's a good a place as any to start with an author. You can see he led a pretty short life. His wife outlived him by a few years, and they have a very complex relationship, as I'll talk about here in a minute. And some of that relationship creeps into the story that we have for this week. Um, his tombstone, he and his wife were both buried in the same cemetery in Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And you can see this is the last line from The Great Gatsby, one of the great novels of the 20th century. You may notice that when you always see F. Scott Fitzgerald, you see F. Scott Fitzgerald, and here you see his entire name. He was, in fact, a direct descendant of Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. As you can see here from the slide, he had a kind of an interesting life. He's from St. Paul, Minnesota, went to Princeton, was in the Army at the end of World War I, as a lot of late, 20th century writers were. And that experience, even though it might have been very short and they may never have seen combat, had a tremendous effect on them. Faulkner, as you know, was also a World War I veteran, although he didn't see combat. Hemingway was a World War I veteran who did see combat, but as an ambulance driver in an organization attached to the Italian army. This charming woman here on the left is Zelda. He met his wife in about 1920, and they were married, obviously, until he died in about 1940. We talk about him as a jazz age figure. This is a period in the 20s and the 30s, well, the 20s especially, where people were just kind of going crazy. The stock market was booming. The economy was booming after the First World War, after a small depression at the beginning of it, 1920, 1921. And so the whole age, at least this is the impression you get, if you read Great Gatsby, you see it repeated over and over again, that this is the age where anything goes. Restrictions on people's roles were different. People dressed differently. People acted very differently. And of course, the music was very different as well. It's hard to imagine a period like that in our own time, maybe the 90s, although not everybody would make that comparison. He wrote a number of books. We'll talk about those here in a minute. And he made a living writing screenplays in the 1930s, although he wasn't always successful at it. But like a lot of other writers, Faulkner, they did write screenplays and they did try to make money at it. Fitzgerald was famous for his novels more than anything else. This Side of Paradise, his first book, was very much about flappers and gin-drinking men from the early part of the 1920s. The Great Gatsby, probably his best book, comes in 1925, and it's, of course, sort of the archetypal depiction of the Jazz Age. If you've seen the DiCaprio remake of the 1974 Robert Redford movie, it gives you a pretty good idea of what life was like for wealthy people in this period. There's not a lot of stories about poor people in the 20s, although there were a lot. And of course, African Americans and anyone else who wasn't the same color as rich white people suffered in that period. And we certainly know that from Ellison's story of Party Down at the Square. Tender is the Night, 1934 novel, was not quite as successful as Great Gatsby, but it's still one that many people read and find it endlessly fascinating. The Last Tycoon is about Hollywood. He never finished it. It was published finally in 1941 in sort of truncated form. In addition to that, he wrote a number of books of short stories, and our particular short story, Babylon Revisited, comes from one of those. He has 2 essays on writing. See if I find a link for those. And of course, he wrote lots of criticism for different kinds of publications. As we know, Babylon Revisited is set in Paris in the 1930s. The story was published in 1935, and we know that this is, just from internal clues in the short story, we know that this is after the stock market crash, because they all talk about losing their money, but it's in the early 30s, early to mid 30s, when economies are slowly regaining their feet. 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany, and although that certainly doesn't show up in the novel, Prague, where Charlie, the main character, finds a job, is an area that is selling a lot of weapons to the Germans because the Czechs are famous for their weapons making. The Skoda Arms Works are an extraordinarily large and profitable and advanced technological business. There's no indication in the story that that's who Charlie's working for, that he's not an arms dealer, but he is working in Prague and Czechoslovakia at that time, which was a country, not like it is now, two countries, was riding a small boom as a result of the German economy because they're right next to Germany. Um, After the stock market crash. I have some pictures in here. This is just a general street in Paris from the 1930s. That'll give you a little bit of idea what the city looked like, the kind of place that Charlie would have wandered around in. This is the Rue Palatine, and this is what it looks like now. It hasn't really changed very much. It's in the 6th arrondissement, or the Luxembourg Gardens area, on the left bank of the Seine. This is actually where Fitzgerald lived for a while. It's also where Hemingway lived for a while. This is the street sign for the name. You can see it's named after uh, Anne of Bavaria, who was the Palatine princess. Palatine is the area along the Rhine in Germany. I used to live in the province of Rhineland-Palatinate, in fact. This is a relatively contemporary picture of the Ritz Bar, which is where the story opens. And the bar looks very much like it looked when Fitzgerald's character goes there. So even though everybody's in modern dress in here, this is what Charlie would have seen. He would have seen the bottles, he would have seen the taps, he would have seen the ornately carved bar. The clothing would have been different, but that's what it looked like. And so this might give you an idea, these two pictures in particular, about what kind of world Charlie is inhabiting. And again, parts of Paris have been very modernized. The Rue Palatinate happens to be one of them, but this particular block gives you an idea of what it looked like, certainly when Fitzgerald wrote the story. For those of you who are history or Dan Brown fans, for those of you who've read the Da Vinci Code, Saint-Sulpice, one of the churches that features very prominently in the Da Vinci Code, is on the Rue Palatine, I'm sorry. There's a point in the story pretty early on when Charlie walks through Montmartre, which is an area around a different church on the other side of the Seine. It was still full of bars and restaurants and nightclubs and things like that. It's an interesting place to go. And he talks about uh, a particular jazz club that's called the Gates of Heaven and the Gates of Hell. Well, this is a picture of the Gates of Hell. There's another entrance further over. I couldn't find an image that had both of them in it. That is the Gate of Heaven, and it's very different. But this is the kind of place that Charlie passes by. He goes to Josephine Baker's cafe, very famous African-American dancer who just happens to be from St. Louis. He goes to Bricktop, another famous African-American entertainer. You'll find that Paris, by the way, is one of those places where African-Americans find themselves very comfortable. The French have very few color prejudices in the way that Americans did at the time, and some still do, obviously. So you find a lot of Americans, African-American entertainers, who go to France and are able to make a living. They operate jazz bands, they're musicians, they're dancers. Paris is just that kind of place where it really is an enormous melting pot. There's a point at which Charlie takes his daughter to a restaurant, and these are two crappy postcard images I was able to find that show you what that restaurant looked like, the Grand Vatel. It's still in business, but it's massively different now from what it looked like back then. These were pictures taken around the end of the First World War. And the interior of the restaurant, as you can see, is pretty ornate, very staid, very gilded. And Charlie takes his daughter there because he says it's the only place that doesn't remind him of champagne lunches that start at 2 and end in some kind of fuzzy experience. It's the kind of place where you had to behave. And I just put this in here to give you an idea of what people in the 30s in Paris who were wealthy and young and attractive might have worn. So I thought this might give you a little idea of what Charlie might have worn and maybe what his wife or what Marion might have worn. Lincoln, Marion's husband, might have worn something very similar, the idea of a three-piece suit and a hat. And of course, a woman wearing nothing but a dress and always a hat when she goes out. So now that we have an idea about the milieu, the setting for this story, we can talk a little bit about what the story might give us to think about. First, all the characters, the major characters in the story, are Americans who happen to be living abroad. Um, this was relatively common back then, at least for some Americans. It's not something that everybody in the country said, "Oh my God, let's go to Paris, let's go to London." People didn't do that. Most people stayed at home. But Americans who exiled themselves to Europe, what we call expatriates, uh, was really a really large and fairly cosmopolitan group. You could live cheaper in Europe and have a lot more fun, especially in a place like Paris, than you could in the United States. Because, of course, from 1919 until 1934 in the United States, we had prohibition. So it was very hard to buy liquor in the US. In France, Germany, Prague, London, those kind of places, there was no such thing as prohibition. So if you were a drinker, Paris was the place to go. So these are Americans who have left their country for a variety of reasons, maybe for business, maybe for pleasure, maybe for the easy access to the kinds of indulgences, nightclubs, bars, alcohol, relatively fluid sexual mores, um, that you would not have been able to find in the United States, at least not in the same way. Okay. And I think, it's just kind of fun being an American living overseas. I spent 8 years of my life in Germany in the Army. I grew up in the Philippines and in England because my dad was a naval officer. So I've spent, I don't know, probably 15 years of my life living overseas. And I'm really much happier doing it. And so some of you may also have similar kinds of experience where you've come from the United States and you've lived overseas for a while. Or you might be one of those folks who's emigrated to the United States from a country that maybe doesn't offer all the charms that Paris in the 1930s do. So you know what it's like to be out of place. You know what it's like to have a certain kind of license because you're not a local. Maybe there's things you can do or not do. You can make different kinds of choices. But that's part of the background here in the story, and I think it's an important thing to think about. The stock market crash in 1929, nobody saw it coming, just like people didn't see the financial crisis in 2008. So people were spending money like crazy, like Charlie and his wife do and their friends do in the story. And then suddenly there's the crash, and literally overnight, people's money is just wiped out. I mean, it's hard to imagine the effect of the 1929 stock market crash on the American economy. We didn't recover as a country until we started spending money for World War II to arm ourselves for the Second World War. So the Depression, which is where this story occurs, happens uh, all over the world. It's not just the American economy that crashes, but other economies crash too. And so there's this tremendous loss of economic power, economic assets, and individual wealth. And people have to grapple with that in different ways. In the United States, for example, a third of the country is out of work in the Depression. I mean, that's one third. My grandfather was an electrical engineer and he didn't have a job for 2 years. I can't imagine that. It scarred my dad his whole life, that he always wanted a job with security and a pension that couldn't be taken away. And he spent 34 years in the Navy. And actually, that was transmitted to me, I think. And I spent 27 years in the Army to make sure I would have a retirement. Um, anyway, so at the time the story's set, people are coming out of it um, as Charlie is able to get a job, he's making money, and he's actually doing quite well. His brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Lincoln and Marion, are not. They were not high flyers in the 20s. They stayed within their means. They didn't go out of their way to make a lot of money. They didn't have the kind of fun that Charlie and Helen did. And they resent the fact that uh, Charlie and Helen had experiences that they did not. And of course, tragic things happen. Helen dies. Marion ends up becoming a guardian for her sister, Helen's daughter, Charlie's daughter. Uh, so that's going on here as well. There's a tremendous amount of, what's the word I'm looking for? Jealousy or flux or, the kind of things where we get kind of envious of people who've been able to do things that maybe we haven't done. And then we might also feel smug afterwards by saying, see, look, boy, you sure didn't come out of that okay. But Charlie is a little different in the sense that he has, in fact, bettered himself. As he says, I'm making more money now than I did before I lost everything. So he's actually better off than he was 5 years before. Families are interesting. Charlie is has no living relatives, at least in the story. Lincoln and Marion are a married couple. Honoria, well, of course, Charlie has Honoria. I don't know why I forgot that. She's his daughter, but he doesn't have an intact family. He wants to bring his daughter back with him to Prague. He's hiring a governess. He's got a bigger apartment. And so you've got that Charlie trying to put his family back together, Lincoln and Marion trying to figure out if they can accommodate him or not. And that brings us to this question of obligations. What kind of obligations does a father have to his daughter? What kind of obligations do family members have to another relative? What kind of obligations do parents have to children, even if they're not their own and they've been, adopted or are fostered by parents? Then what exactly are the obligations of those parents towards these children? And that's kind of the role that Marion and Lincoln have with regard to Honoria. What exactly do they owe her? And of course, there's another obligation, and that's between Marion and her dead sister. She blames, as you know from the story, Helen's death on Charlie in part. And so that sense of obligation to make sure that nothing happens to Honoria comes from this obligation that she has to Helen and Helen's memory. Something else to think about here is male-female roles. I mean, you could look at Marion and Lincoln and try to figure out what their life is like as a couple, as a family, as parents. We know what their apartment's like. We know what their children are like. But within that, you kind of have to figure out who's in charge and who's not. If you were a gender critic, you might look at this and say, well, Lincoln's clearly in charge because he's the male and women had fewer rights then and all that. But of course, that's not historically accurate. It's also not accurate in this case because the guardianship of Honoria is Marion's, not Lincoln's. He can only suggest or cajole. He can't order her. He can't direct her. He has no legal authority over this child at all. So when it comes to who gets to call the shots, is it males or females? Charlie is clearly a male who's acting as a supplicant. He can't come in and just take this child away. So his role is not necessarily as clear-cut as we might like to think it is, or as Charlie might like to think it is. Although he really does agonize over all this, and he spends a lot of time in the story, I think, talking about sort of, can I do this? Can I not do this? Am I being fair? Things like that. So he's really wrestling with this issue. Marion has a lot of power in this story. There's another woman, Laura, in the story, who is one of the reasons that things don't not end up ending well. And so you might want to look at her role in this story and figure out, is she like kind of the antonym, the opposite of Marion? She's still flirting around with other people. She's married, but her husband lets her go to Europe on an allowance as long as she doesn't come back. Marion might look at someone like her very differently than Marion looks at herself. And so you might want to look at those two contrasting female roles a little bit and see if there's anything in there that intrigues you. Same thing with men. Duncan and Lincoln are polar opposites. Some might argue that sort of Duncan is an ungrown up Charlie, that this is what Charlie used to be, and Marion still thinks he is. But the roles there are kind of complicated. So how fully developed are these characters? How male are they or female? That might be something for us to look at. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention here is that the city is described in great detail. Clearly, Charlie loves the place. And for any of you who spent a fair amount of time in Paris, you might have the same kinds of feelings. For me, it's one of my favorite cities in the world. I spent a lot of time there. It's been a while since I've been to Paris, but in my head, it's still one of the 2 or 3 places I would really like to live. Look at the descriptions of the settings, of the buildings, of the light, of the people, of the different places that Charlie goes, and see if you can't see Paris as not just a setting, but as kind of a character. Does it shape any of these relationships? Does it shape any of these characters? Does it indeed come to shape the ultimate outcome of the story? Well, I will leave you with those cheerful thoughts, and we'll see what happens. Thank you very much.